to goods and services at all levels of government, depending obviously on sometimes what we have received in returns in terms of commitments, the specific level of access that's given. We're in the midst of a major revision. There's a whole review of the procurement system, mostly driven by an attempt again to try to simplify. It's, as always, easier said than done, especially when you have 27 member states around the table with also their ideas about what simplification entails, and trying to hammer out, and not to also forget the European Parliament, all with their ideas about what we should be doing. But the package is moving forward, so we hope in a foreseeable future that we'll have a new framework in place. We have also in this revision been looking at rules for encouraging access to public procurement, but we don't have any set-asides for SMEs. And I think the interesting thing about, coming back to your presentation this morning about whether these SME set-asides works, the figures I've seen actually shows that small and medium-sized enterprises in Europe are more successful without set-aside actually gaining contracts. So doesn't mean we found the holy grail, but it's interesting to at least see in practice that apparently even without these set-asides, you can have some success. We'd like to see more success for small and medium-sized enterprises in this area. And improve existing guarantees, proposals. Also, this is an important new feature, is that we're now looking at concessions. Again, this is also quite, again, Claudio, who will be here, I think tomorrow, Friday, will, I'm sure, talk more about the challenges of getting this concessions proposal through the Council and the Parliament. So, benefits, again, studies in the EU showed that benefits have generated about 30% savings of taxpayer money, so not insignificant, again, if you relate that to the figures I mentioned at the outset. And on the backside, if you look at the potential cost for that corruption can lead to in terms of price increases in the range of 25, even up to 50%. So we have a system, we hope there should be a system which increases economic efficiency, good governance, and accountability. Then for businesses, and that, of course, the way it works when we talk free trade agreements, one of the first things we do typically as trade officials is we invite stakeholders to meetings to hear about their particular difficulties in gaining access. So it's very much, because again, this comes to the difference between what the law actually says and how it's implemented in practice. I mean, as trade officials, despite linguistic difficulties, we can have text translated, we can read the laws. What we need stakeholders to tell us is, okay, this is what the law says, but this is not how it works in practice. This is what happens in practice. So that's a very important part of the preparation process, is to have businesses who worked in the particular markets tell us, this is the reality we're confronted with. These are why we have very big difficulties gaining a foothold in these particular markets, because there are rules that are either unwritten or sometimes written, but written somewhere where it's not so easy to find, that makes it very difficult for them to get a foothold. So obviously they have an interest in gaining access. At the moment now, with the EU economy being what it is, of course for businesses that are, and again, if you break it down per sector, there's some sectors who, of course, their major customer is the government. They are in a particular line of business where there's basically either biggest customer, or at least maybe their only customer is governments. At a time where budgets in Europe have shrunk, they're of course even more interested in looking outside in order to avoid layoffs, looking for opportunities outside of Europe. And we do that because we think we can try to access and leverage the access to our market. Should be an appeal as well, so there's a win-win situation for both sides. And again, what we do through trade agreements, we can't, of course, through a trade agreement, guarantee that they'll be successful in any particular contract. That depends on the quality of their bid and how it's put together, the prices, etc. What we can try to do is we can create additional transparency where that's the problem that's lacking. And in many countries that is a big problem. We can create at least less likelihood, and transparency obviously is a big part of that equation, that they will not be discriminated against. Again, it comes, in many cases, comes back again how you work with the transparency principles. And again, may sound for some a bit odd, but there are countries where the possibilities of legal challenge are very restricted and very costly. That obviously, again, is a way of disciplining the authorities, that they are not playing with the rules of the game because there is an effective possibility for legal challenge. And then we, of course, also see that because of the other side, of course, is that there will be increased competition on the EU market, that we would like to see that also act as an incentive for our own companies to become more competitive and look for export opportunities if we can gain access to foreign markets for them. Briefly about the GPA. So first version, 1981, it was improved in 96, and we've recently had the revision of 2011, December 2011. There are currently 15 parties, EU counts as one, US, Canada, Japan, etc., etc. But it is what in WTO terminology is called a plurilateral agreement. It's not a multilateral agreement. You don't have all members. So there's still, as you can see from that, it's one of the big areas of international trade rules that are not universally applied. I hope Stephen's right that we will see more and it will become a model. But it is still an area where the fact that we only have 15 parties gives you some illustration of the sensitivities in this area and the reluctance of many governments to open this up to foreign competition. There are currently 3 countries negotiating access, China being obviously the big one, Jordan and Ukraine. And it has rules on transparency, non-discrimination, and national treatment, classical principles when we talk about trade rules. I'll come back to this last bullet point at the end when I talk about our particular instrument. This is, if you will, the positive side. Our market is currently opened up to about 95% of our procurement market is contestable, at least de facto. Which is quite significant opening. We wish our trading partners were equally open, and I'll come to that in a bit in one of the later slides. So as I mentioned, we try through, particularly through free trade agreements, to, as a systematic issue, include a chapter on public procurement. And obviously, we take inspiration from GPA, but also from our domestic legislation. We're not trying to rewrite the rule book every time. But it's clear that for many countries, at least even if they're not GPA members, feel a bit perhaps more comfortable with being the GPA because it's a plurilateral text. It's been negotiated between many different parties. But those are the sort of parameters we start from. We look at our own legislation, we look at GPA. If we're sitting down with a GPA partner, which we will shortly, in the case of Japan, we're just about to start free trade negotiations with Japan. And this summer we should also be starting with the US, is obviously we look to go beyond GPA. It's not much sense in writing a new procurement chapter and just agreeing on what we've already agreed GPA. We'd like to take it beyond. And a good example is one of our most recent comprehensive trade agreements was with Korea, where we go in many areas go beyond what Korea has agreed to in GPA in the area of public works concessions, BOT contracts, etc. So that is, if you will, GPA in those situations become the baseline, and we try to build on that. So what are the challenges seen from an EU perspective? We have always, because we've gone through the process internally, so we've done some of the heavy lifting internally, and it was difficult. It's taken quite many years to get the kind of procurement regime we have in place now, but we have one, and so we think that we've gone through it, and we'd like to see other countries go through that process with us to open their domestic procurement markets to EU businesses as well. Problem is that public authorities often see procurement as a means to achieve a lot of other policy goals, whether it's promoting local businesses. There's the whole problem of transparency, or rather lack of transparency and accountability, which has also, in certain cases, leads to abuse. Of course, the end result is, as authorities, you don't get necessarily best value for money. And then we have this problem of our degree of openness is out of kilter with many of our trading partners. And I will, as I said, I have a slide where I'm talking about a little bit about what we see as the imbalance in the level of openness. So what are the kinds of preferences or obstacles that we typically encounter? Price preferences, obviously, very often used for local companies, SMEs, disadvantaged groups. The imagination knows no limits. Legislators are incredibly creative in this area. So you really have to go into and read the legislation. In many cases, they're added on to legislation that has nothing to do with procurement. So it's the research, and there we depend a lot on industry to help us point us in the right direction, because they're the ones who initially run the head against the wall. And then there are outright, sometimes, prohibitions against purchase foreign goods and services, or from foreign suppliers. Set-asides for SMEs or other groups. Offsets, another big issue. Very, very common. And at the moment, we see in certain markets, this seems to become the flavor of the month. There are certain countries who are really experimenting with this and seem to have now developed or in the process of developing offset policies, to some extent even considering imposing offset policies on private businesses who are procuring domestically, that they have to procure in telecom sector is one. In particular India, where this is a big discussion at the moment. And then other direct measures, technical specifications, how they draft it. I wish, Anna mentioned the example of cars. I wish it was that simple that it's, you know, an Audi is as good as a, but the way the technical specs are written, sometimes you have everything but the name of the product at the bottom. So it's very, very clear who is, and I'm not targeting Russia in particular in this. I think everybody is, everybody is guilty to some extent of that. But that is very clearly, again, very creative ways of saying everything but the product name and the brand name at the bottom. That is something, again, how are these drafted? And then administrative burden, also a problem in many countries. The kinds of, especially as foreign companies, the kinds of additional documents you have to supply, translation, legalization, notarization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. By the time you finish the process, the train has left the station and you're out of the game. So, not always, I think, for the right reasons. So here is, if you look at openness, we tried when we did the preparation for this international procurement initiative, which I'll talk about at the end, to look a bit about how access actually happens in the real world. So if you look at, and this is a sort of a globalized figure for the looking outside the EU, about 25% of the GPA partners' markets are committed. You have then de facto opening, in some cases on average, we've made a rough estimate about 10%. Then 11% where companies, through their ingenuity, manage to bypass whatever the restrictions are. So, but we still have this 53% part, which is where they're really struggling because they are domestic trade barriers in one form or the other that really creates difficulties for them to operate. And not least, again, for SMEs. I mean, for some bigger companies, they can sometimes get around it by establishing themselves domestically, if there's a possibility for foreign direct investment. In some cases that's not possible, but if it is possible, that may, in some cases, be a way of getting around the obstacles. So let's look just for briefly at China. So I mentioned there are observers in the GPA. They're negotiating access. I think everybody except the Chinese will agree that their initial offers are disappointing. There's a lot left, in particular below central level, that is not covered yet. But it's moving. I mean, if you look at the evolution from their first offer to their second offer, it's moving, but it's moving very slowly. The URA, their default position is the market is closed. That doesn't mean European companies don't occasionally get contracts, but it is at the discretion and at the whim of the authorities. So it is not something, obviously, for business who are trying to make long-term strategic business decisions, something they can base themselves on. There's a huge degree of uncertainty. Again here, a beginning of a proliferation of binational policies. There was last year, both the US and we worked very diligently because there was a proliferation of what was called the Indigenous innovation policies. Even after the at central level had actually abolished the legal basis for these proliferation, and the Chinese authorities would tell us everything is now solved, we were able to deliver to them package of local authority specifications said for these products, these are the products you can procure, and they happen to be all Chinese. So we're not there yet. And local content requirements up to 50%, 20% price references, and even, as I said, possibilities in some cases go up to 70. So de facto, the Chinese market is pretty closed. As I said, doesn't mean that never are successful operation it is, but and it's getting, if anything, at least de facto is getting worse. It's not getting better at the moment. So now Russia, again, not a GPA member, but has agreed to provide market access and domestic treatment to all WTO partners if reciprocal. But the absence of a bilateral agreement does create legal uncertainty because the degree of openness that exists de facto can, of course, if there's no legal commitment, can be changed overnight. The policy government can change, policy can change in that particular area. We've had some difficulties in getting Russia into meaningful negotiations in the context of what's called a new agreement, is to replace a previous bilateral agreement with Russia. And in fact, I was just reading on my machine as I was coming over a cable from our delegation in Moscow that there are now, again, additional bi-Russian policies that are being promulgated. So, for example, in the field of pharmaceuticals. So I think there's, again, work to be done. And we certainly would be happy to talk to our Russian counterparts and trying to improve the position. Brazil, again, not a GPA member, nor do we have any bilateral commitments. We have, for some time, had Mercosur negotiations. They're not moving very fast, to put it very bluntly. And we have, I think, even not gotten any sort of basic understanding on what the scope of a possible procurement chapter would be in the Mercosur agreement. So very difficult part. And again here, a proliferation of Brazilian policies, price preferences up to 25% in all areas of procurement. So, and these are increasing rather than decreasing the number of policies in this area. India. Oh, again, observer, and that was a very positive signal. I think we and others found that a very positive when India became an observer in the GPA. Estimated market, again, difficult to get very solid figures, but I think 30% of GDP is not completely off the rails, but it is in that order, I think. De jure and de facto, there is, in many sectors, not major difficulties in getting access. Actually, getting the contracts is another, but that comes probably from other issues than that you're not even allowed to bid. So in that sense, But there is a real problem in terms of transparency, and I think the Indian government is very aware of this. They have a major procurement reform in the parliament. I think the latest news we have is that it may not pass in the next monsoon session, unfortunately, and then there are elections. So the prospects for this major procurement reform a little bit uncertain at the moment. And then there is, again, local content requirement for certain sectors, and there are now a proliferation. We hear practically every week that different ministries are now trying to promulgate their own local content requirements. So in some sectors it goes up to 100%, which in the age of global supply chains, I think in some cases not even realistic to go for 100%. So again, we have work to do. So briefly at the end here, so what have we been doing? We've seen in particular this proliferation of local content requirement or binational policies. I think the EU, after with some stops and starts achieving our own liberalization and harmonization of our internal market, thought we had a model that everybody would be impressed by and be inspired by. Reality, I think we've discovered somewhat belatedly, is not quite that. And that we have, because of the very openness of our market, which brings benefits in terms of choice for public authorities, but it has a tendency that our trading partners take this openness for granted. And as a result, they are not that keen typically when we take down to talk public procurement with us, even given the size of our market, because their businesses are not banging on the door saying that they're encountering major difficulties. I'm not saying they always have a smooth ride in the EU, but they're not sufficiently banging on the door of governments that the governments come to us and say, we need to sort this out, we need to negotiate. So that we have the reverse problem. They're banging on our door every week, coming with new problems in particular markets. So we have a bit of this imbalance, and we have been looking at ways, how can we try to rebalance the equation? We had a public consultation in 2010, which basically showed two different camps. There were some who wanted something extremely dramatic done. They said, everything that we have not promised our trading partners, close it. So close it off for foreign competition. Then we can negotiate and we can open it up selectively to those who want to talk to us. We were not very keen on that option. The other option was leave everything as it is. It's fine. Don't touch it. What we have tried is to steer a middle ground to be applied after the EU has acted, etc. So we have a real need also internally to clarify things for our member states. And as I said, this proliferation is increasing, creating difficulties at a time where businesses are beginning looking even more outside of Europe for opportunities. And we have, because the large degree of openness, we have a problem with leverage, so that our trading partners don't take us sufficiently serious when we want to talk about market access. So what we've been trying to do is, first of all, trying to clarify what are the conditions for access, and the default rule we have established in the proposal that's on the table of the Council is we have a default rule which I think few other, if any, trading partners has. The default rule is openness. So the EU market is open unless there's an action to do something. So that is already, I think, a major positive signal. Then we reflect all our international commitments, GPA, FTA related, everything is respected and implemented. And then we've developed new tools, and I now forget whether we have one more slide. No. So there are two pillars to this proposal. One is that national authorities can, in cases where we have no international commitments, can decide that they want to exclude a foreign bidder. But they can only do that after notifying it and getting clearance from the Commission. Why do we do that? Because if they misread the commitments or abuse the commitments, who gets in trouble? It's the EU gets pulled into dispute settlement, and we have to answer for it. So we want to have some check that either deliberately or mistaken, because these commitments are not always very easy to read, to be honest, that there is not a misunderstanding of what our international obligations are. And secondly, is this possibility if we have a particular trading partner where there are persistent market access problems and the partner refuses to engage with us, that we can launch, first step, an investigation. If the investigation confirms that there is a persistent market access problem, we invite that we open a procedure where we invite that partner as a first step to negotiations, with a view to find a negotiated outcome. And if the partner says we don't want to talk to you, or after 2 years of talking and there's no progress whatsoever, we can selectively, for areas where there's no commitments, we can close. And said, okay, if you don't want to talk, you don't want to provide any additional access for our businesses, we will close off for your bidders for a while until you come back to the negotiating table and we sort this out. So, as I said, this is now in the Council and Parliament. It has received, I think, quite a positive welcome in the Parliament, less so among member states. There's again the same divide we saw in the public consultations. Some think it's too little, some think it's too much. So where that will end, I'm not going to go predicting at this point, but that has some tough negotiations ahead of us. But I think there's a realization that the current situation is not acceptable and we need to do something to change the status quo. So I hope I stuck more or less to the 30 minutes. Yeah.